Well, good morning, everyone. We are going to have a music history moment today. A number of music history moments coming your way over these next weeks and months, or however long we have to do this. But we're going to read from a book called Bach, Beethoven, and the Boys by David Barber. This is a book that is called Music History as It Ought to Be Taught. I think you will enjoy what it has to say and maybe learn something along the way. So feel free to grab yourself a cup of coffee, a cup of hot cocoa or whatever, sit by the fire, enjoy this fire, and just enjoy what I have to read to you about the first chapter, early music. Although the ancient Greeks had a thing or two to say about music, and Plato thought it was a pretty good idea, though with some reservations. And before that prehistoric man probably hummed some sort of Macedon hunting song as he set off from his cave each morning. Music history as we know it is usually said to have begun with Gregorian chant. On the theory that it had to start somewhere, it came about like this. One morning back in the 16th century or so, a bunch of the boys at the local monastery got together for a regular morning worship. One of the monks had been up late the night before, translating a passage of Paul's letter to the Ephesians, or some such, and fell asleep in the middle of the service. In order to hide from the abbot the sound of his snoring, some of the other monks began to sing verses of the daily song. Chanting was born. Actually, there's no evidence whatsoever to support this, theory, but it makes at least as much sense as what Pope Gregory told everyone. He said a dove had flown down from heaven, perched on his shoulder, and dictated all the chants into his ear. Take your pick. Snoring monk, flying pigeon, whichever. Or dove, I guess not a pigeon. At any rate, by about the 9th century, the principles of Gregorian chant were established as a sort of monastic etiquette, telling the monks what to sing, and for what, and for how long. Guido of Arezzo was one of those who figured out that the scribes would have an easier time writing down the music if they had lines to guide them. If he'd thought harder, he might have gone to fame and fortune by inventing the coloring book. However, Guido was a clever fellow, but he had a low opinion of singers. He said they were the most stupid of men of our times. Side note, before that, it was rather haphazard. He also had some nasty things to say about monks. He thought they spent too much time trying to sing and not enough time studying the scriptures. He was always complaining about something. Guido is most famous for inventing the Guidonian hand, which is a funny little drawing of a hand with squiggles all over it. He claimed that by studying the little squiggles, you could remember all the notes of every plain chant mode. Don't panic, modes are really just like scales. Nowadays, hardcore musicians put posters of Guido's hand on their walls to make themselves look scholarly. Monks divided the day into successive hours, which they also called offices. Each monk had a little sign on the door to his room that said, office hours. Each office had its own particular music that would be sung every day. This was strictly codified. When it came to singing, the Gregorians left nothing to chance. Plain song was sung in 3 different styles, depending on how many notes there were in each syllable of the text. If there was only one note, it was called syllabic. With 2 or 3 notes, pneumatic, or pneumatic since it took more air. Pneumatic with a P if it took more air, but pneumatic musically. If there were so many notes that you forgot what you were singing, that was called melismatic. Eventually, some of the melismatic sections got so convoluted that someone had the idea of putting words back into them again. Often it had been so long since anyone had sung the words that no one could remember what they had been singing about in the first place, so the new words had little to do with the original text. These new texts were known as tropes, and they were rather entertaining until some spoilsport on the Council of Trent banned them all together in the 16th century. For people who are more familiar with later styles of music, Gregorian chant takes some getting used to. The sound of men's voices on a single line sound more like a swarm of bees, but it's really very beautiful if you give it a chance. Useful too. The time it takes to chant the Miserere, Psalm 51, is just right for steeping a pot of tea. Now you know. There were hardly any women involved in all of this. It was mostly men. If you're looking for someone to blame St. Paul. In his first epistle to the Corinthians, he says, Malevarius in ecclesiis techant. I don't know, that's my Latin for you. Let your women keep silent in the churches. Everyone took him literally. Gregorian chants developed into something called organum, which was all the rage in the 9th to 12th centuries. In its simplest form, this consisted of singing the same Gregorian tune as the monk beside you at an interval of a perfect fourth or fifth, which is not worth explaining why fourths or fifths are called perfect. Just take my word for it, they're perfect. It's not worth explaining. This is harder to do than it sounds, however, and requires the kind of concentration that monks are especially good at. Sophisticated organum was developed into a high art form by two composers at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris in the 12th and 13th centuries, Léonin and his successor, Periton. They published a collection of their music in a big book called the Magnus Liber. Probably the Manus Liber, but Magnus Liber is way more fun to say, which is Latin for big book. Much of what we know about the music of Léonin and Periton comes to us from a treatise by an anonymous Englishman written about 1280. He differs from almost all other anonymous writer because he has a name. Well, sort of. To distinguish him from all the other anonymous writers, he is referred to as Anonymous the Fourth. Anonymous the First to the Third never amounted to much, apparently. All of the anonymouses, through all of the years, Anonymous Fourth is the only one anyone remembers by his name. His mother must be very proud, whoever she is. One of the most important features of the Notre Dame motet is the use of a rhythmic pattern or mode. Modes. Rhythmic patterns or modes. Whole academic careers have been based on finding whether Periton meant the tunes to go dum to dum to dum or ti-dum ti-dum ti-dum. For some people, this is an earth-shattering decision. Two French musicologists named Beck and Aubry went so far as to fight a sword duel over the issue in 1910. Musicology hasn't seen anything quite as exciting since. Aubry lost. He died of embarrassment or stab wounds or both. Meanwhile, as all this church music was going on, the troubadours and the trouveres were busy singing racier songs about true love and good wine, and how much better one was with the other. It is nearly impossible to distinguish between the troubadours and the trouveres, and don't let anyone con you into believing otherwise. Troubadours tend to hang around the south of France and travel north. Trouveres hang around the north and one south. Other than that, they're pretty much the same. The most important thing to remember, if you're a troubadour, was to sing a heartfelt song about how much you love the woman of your dreams, how lovely her hair was, how beautiful her eyes and skin, how much you long to kiss her, that sort of thing. You and the object of your love were meant for each other. True love like this had never before been seen. If only you could rid of the husband, everything would be perfect. There's always a catch. By the 14th century, this tradition of songs about unrequited love had developed into a real industry, almost as big as the pop songs of today. Everybody composed weepy songs about lost loves and cruel beauties. In between sobbing fits, they managed to write some of the music down into fancy heart-shaped manuscripts. They thought it looked cute. The 20th century descendants of these composers grew up to be copywriters for the major greeting card companies. And that, my friends, is the end of the section on early music. Till next week, when we see again and we realize we're getting somewhere.